sorry to the folks on Zoom there. So I was just saying, I did this work, my name is Fiona Scarf, I did this work with colleagues Taylor Green and Mike Calver at Murdoch Uni. They were interested in understanding how the research coming out of Australian museums has changed over the last 40 years. And the bit that they got me to look at was how has the subject matter of that research changed. So we used structural topic models to do that. So the central mission of topic models is that you take a set of documents, we call it a corpus of documents. So that might be some novels like the ones you see pictured, or a body of scholarly work, or something quite informal like photo captions. And looking at the text in those documents, we infer what topics, what's the subject matter that those documents address. And then it's a particular feature of structural topic models that they allow us to fit covariates to look at how that subject matter varies through the documents. So amongst those novels, you can see the earliest was David Copperfield in the 19th century. Some of them were written very recently, like Wolf Hall, Song of the Crocodile. So are we seeing changes in subject matter that relate to, say, the year of publication, for instance, or maybe the nationality of the authors? But we weren't looking at novels, we were looking at the research output from Australian museums of natural history. So these are institutions that research the natural environment with a particular emphasis on animals. And we felt that there had been some changing pressures and opportunities since the 1980s. To begin with, that period has seen the absolute flowering of gene technology, and that provides a lot of tools that are pertinent to the core museum mission of cataloguing living organisms and working out how closely related they are to each other. That period has also seen the blossoming of conservation biology as a science. So we thought those things might impact what topics people were researching. The internet age has also opened up opportunities for remote collaboration across that period, and perhaps also made it easier to do multidisciplinary collaboration as well. And all of that has happened against a backdrop of museums having fewer staff and less money, and therefore more pressure to show that the work they're doing is socially relevant. So we wanted to know, how's the subject matter in museum research changed since the 1980s? So here is the underlying model. We've got a bunch of documents that contain a bunch of words. And we suppose that every document canvasses one or more topics to some varying degree of emphasis, and that those topics have associated with them particular words that are more likely to be used in relation to those topics. So we can't observe the topics directly, they're a latent variable, but we feel that if we could infer them, then we could better understand what is the subject matter that the documents are addressing, and how does that vary across the documents. So our inputs are, we know which words go in which documents because we can read them. And we're also going to specify, that is disturbing. I can't advance the slide. That's right. For the moment, it's all right. We're also going to specify how many topics we're going to kind of impose on this body of work. So
technical issues.
So just, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So we wind up with these two distributions we want to infer. Well, come back. Right. We wind up with these two distributions that we want to infer. One on the left there is topic prevalence, which governs how common are the topics in the documents. And that's modelled as a multivariate logistic normal. So the multivariate is however many topics we're imposing, that's how many dimensions that distribution is going to have. And then the other distribution is the topic content. So that governs what kind of words are used in relation to a particular topic. And we express that as the sum of an intercept, which captures the baseline frequency of words. So you can imagine some words are just common in the vocabulary generally, plus a topic-specific deviation. So we can insert covariates into both of those distributions. So for this work here, we're going to put year of publication in as a covariate on topic prevalence. So there's some subjects that become more or less common over time. We didn't impose any covariates in this project on the topic content, but you can imagine, for example, in a set of documents that are describing research, some of them could have been written for a general public audience and some of them for a very specialist scientific audience, and that will affect the choice of words that are used. So you could have two documents that use quite a different vocabulary, but they're talking about the same topic. So the covariate there would capture that. So we've got to infer these two distributions somehow or other, and we do that using an expectation maximisation algorithm. So we start by making some initial guesses about the parameter values for those two distributions. So we're essentially taking a random bunch of words and just mushing them into some topics together. And initially, they're going to be really inappropriate choices. They're going to be words that are very disparate and have nothing to do with each other, but we just got to make a start. And then for each document, we randomly assign each word position to a topic. So we've got our pile of books. We take our first book off the top, open the first page, point to the first word and say, I reckon that word is there as a reference to topic A. And I reckon the second word is there as a reference to topic B, and so on. And then we iterate through between the next two steps. So we ask for each word in each document, how likely is each topic to be responsible for that choice of word? So in the sort of orangey box at the bottom there, I've pasted the first sentence from the abstract of one of the 10,000 odd documents that we analysed. And the first word there is microvertebrate. So we're asking, which just means a little animal with a spine. We're asking, when the author was composing that document and thinking, what word shall I put in this first spot? When they chose that word, what is the subject they were trying to conjure, trying to evoke in the minds of the reader? Given the assumptions that we've made about about what words go in which what words go in which topics and which documents are associated with those topics. So once we've got an estimate on the responsibility there, we can then update in the fourth step what we think are the most likely parameter values for our two distributions that we think would fit with that. And then we can go back and recalculate the responsibilities. And we keep iterating between those two. And at each turning of that cycle, we're ratcheting up the likelihood that we would get the text that we did, given our provisional and evolving estimates of the parameters. So this slide is just kind of about the mechanics of where we got the text from. We just looked on a research citation database, and we've found every publication across our study period that had at least one author that was affiliated with an Australian Natural History Museum. So that gave us about 10,000 publications. For the text, we took the titles and abstracts, so that's what we analysed. We had a bunch of metadata, but for the purpose of this exercise, we're just interested in the year of publication. And then I've gone through and removed all the boring words, which are the words that I didn't want them to influence what subject a document was considered to be talking about. So for an example, a lot of the abstracts had copyright statements at the end of them, with the word copyright followed by the name of the publishing house. And I didn't want that to influence the algorithm's decisions about what that document was about. And then you also go through this word stemming exercise where you want words that mean the same thing to be treated as a single entity, because it just kind of reduces your number of variables. So biodiversity and biodiverse, one of them's a noun, the other one's an adjective. They mean the same thing. Let's just treat them as a single entity. You've got to be a little bit careful with that. So sometimes words have the same root, but they mean something quite different in context. So in the context of this literature, miner would be referring to a leaf miner, which is a kind of insect that makes little tunnels in leaves. And that's completely different from mineralisation, which would tend to be used in relation to either discussing the formation of interesting geological features or the reason why fossils were preserved better because of bones mineralised. So I'm just going to slide over this slide. It talks about how you choose the number of topics that you impose on the corpus. It's a trade-off between having the words in a topic tending to co-occur in documents, so they kind of go together, and exclusivity, which is about the most probable words in a topic not occurring in other topics. So I chose to impose 8 topics on this corpus, and I'm just going to show you 4 out of the 8 word clouds that came out of that. I've got to say, I was just incredibly gratified to see these word clouds were actual subject areas. I was kind of half expecting I'd go through this exercise and just this random mush of words would come out that didn't mean anything. And then these were the first 2 topics, and they are really recognisable areas of museum science. I've given them titles down the bottom. The titles don't come out of the model. I've imposed them myself by looking through much longer lists of words, and also by reading through the abstracts of documents that were identified as having higher prevalence on these topics, and actually making sure I understood what those documents were really about. So here's another 2 subjects that came out, and these were the 2 disciplinary areas that we thought at the outset, oh, we think that these will have had an impact on museum science that's increased over time. So pretty chuffed about that as well. And so this is our kind of grand graph at the end. We've got the year of publication along the x-axis and the relative emphasis in documents published in that year on the vertical axis. And you can see that those first 2 word clouds, organisms new to science and fossils, constitute the bulk of museum science still, but they are in decline. And you can see that molecular genetics, the brown curve down here, and conservation and management, the pink curves, are very much on the increase, but off a really low base. So thanks for listening, says the dinosaur.
Thank you very much, Joan, for that great talk. I'll hand us over to our audience if they have any questions or the Slack. I did have a question from myself to you. Like, obviously now you have a great not a great, but maybe, but a good understanding of museum research in the past 40 or so years. In the next 10 to 20 years, do you see a certain topic that you think might be coming of relevance, or anything that we haven't heard of?
Yeah, well, that's a pretty curly one. I don't know. I don't think I'm doing anything more fancy than extrapolating those curves some more. I think something that is changing in museums is because they've got less and less staff. They're working more and more to think about how they can get their volunteers to produce research, because lots of people like, showing people around museums, and, how can you kind of use citizen science maybe to collect data from quite wide areas that would otherwise cost you a lot of money. And there's been a few projects to do with getting people to go out and listen to frogs all over Australia, you give them an app that tells them what the frog calls are, and they can go out and collect that. And instead of, one museum scientist driving around the whole country, that could be quite an efficient way forward. Yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah.
I'll just let you have a microphone so the folks at home can hear.
So you mentioned you removed words like and the from a bunch of titles and abstracts. Did you just do all that yourself?
Sorry, could you just say that again?
You removed a bunch of boring words from abstracts like and the. Did you just go ahead and do all that yourself?
I did it all myself, but not sort of manually. So I did the whole thing in R, and I had a package called TM, which is short for text mining.
Okay.
So it's got preloaded dictionaries of words kind of like and the and stuff like that. But then I added to them. So I got it to pull up lists of what were the most common words. And I just kind of ran my eyeballs down them and went, oh, copyright, that doesn't sound useful. And so then I added to those dictionaries. And likewise with the word stemming, you can get it to, so that's when you're taking words and just finding the root word. So condensing similar words to the root word. It does that for you, but then I got it to generate lists of what it was stemming. And when I saw, mineralisation and minor, I went, oh, that's a problem. Or another interesting one was that first word cloud, which was about identifying new organisms. Is it going to disrupt you there, Shichi, if we just go back a couple of... so on the left there, a lot of museum work is about, oh, we found a new species, or we found a new record of this species we already knew about, but it's in a different stratigraphic layer or whatever. And because new was such an important word, it was also forcing all the research that was on New Zealand, New South Wales, New England, New Caledonia, and New Guinea into this topic. So I was like, okay, I can deal with this. And I just made New Zealand one word throughout the, and for everything I could think of. But I noticed that, you can see it there, Guinea still came up in that topic. And I kind of, oh, how did that happen? And it was only when I was writing this talk that I thought, I know there would have been a lot of research on new species in New Guinea anyway, but Guinean, so I just got all the words that said New Guinea and changed them to New Guinea. But if something had said Guinean, that wouldn't have gotten shifted. So yeah, it just takes a bit of iterating through manually to kind of keep it tidy, yeah.
So this is really quite interesting, and I can imagine it's really applicable to lots of different areas as well. In my first year working in data, I did something much less sophisticated but similar with health reviews in Western Australia, because there's been dozens of reviews of health, the situation in the health department. Do you know of any other areas where similar research is being done to what you've done with the museum research?
No, although that's not to say that they mightn't be out there. So I kind of stumbled on this method. My colleagues were originally like, oh, how do we summarise what the subject areas are? 10,000 documents is too many to read. Why don't we just look at the titles of the 50 most highly cited and we'll talk about that. And I just thought, oh, I'm just sure we can do something more sophisticated than that. So I'd kind of had this initial idea of I could work out what were the, say, 500 or 1,000 most common words, and then throw them into something like a principal components analysis or something, and try and cluster them. But I thought I'll just see if cleverer people than me have thought about this first in the literature. And so what I've found in terms of other people doing topic models is lots of analysis of news items and tweets and things. So one of the interesting analyses I came across was some social scientists were looking at news flashes that were about China, and they were trying to quantitatively address the question of, is there bias in the way that American media cover China compared to how Chinese media cover China? And they showed that there was. And then they also used their content models, which was about the word choice, to look at descriptions of news events within the US that came up on sites that they had either characterised as progressive or conservative in a political sense, so that you could see that the same event would be described as a peaceful demonstration, or there would be much more use of the word police brutality or you know, anarchy in the streets, depending on who was what was kind of like the political perspective of the people who were writing it. But yes, it'd be an interesting tool for just kind of looking at research, a lot of which is, you know, publicly funded, to try to think about how, you know, how effective we're being and that sort of thing. Yeah.
But thank you so much again, Fiona, for that. Yeah, and if any more questions, just put them on the Slack chat and we'll be able to communicate that way. So we'll go on to our second speaker. So we get our mic set up. I just want to introduce you from ANU. He's going to be talking to us about double fixed rank kriging approach to spatial regression.
Could I just? I might want to use the mouse. Okay, hello everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about joint work that I did with my PhD supervisors, Francis and Ellen. So this work has been published recently in Environmetrics. So if you want to have a look at any of the details, which I won't go into too much, you can have a look at that if you want. Okay, so the motivation of our problem, you can think of as kind of comprising of two main points. So the first point that I have here is that in many disciplines, such as those that I have listed here, environmental monitoring, ecology, epidemiology, and many other fields, they collect and analyze spatially indexed data. So what's so special about spatially indexed data? Well, often if you have spatially indexed data, you might suspect that your responses will have some kind of spatial autocorrelation in them. And that's something you have to account for when you're doing modeling work. So if you, and especially if you think of any kind of data that you might get from geographic information systems, those will also probably be spatially indexed as well. So that's kind of the first part of the problem that we consider. And the second part of the problem that we are considering is, it turns out that in this kind of data, this kind of spatially indexed data, often there is actually going to be some kind of measurement error in the covariance. So often in this type of data, your covariates aren't measured perfectly. And as for why that is a problem, I'll go into that soon. So kind of corresponding to these 2 points, we're gonna separately introduce 2 different models that try to, well, that kind of model these 2 types of behavior. And in this work, we're gonna basically just focus on those 2 models and investigate those models. So here I'm going to just introduce the first spatial model. This is just the spatial generalized linear mixed model, which we use to kind of model that first spatial autocorrelation bit that I just talked about. So it's defined as follows. So we let YSI denote response measured at some spatial location SI for I from 1 up to n. And then I have this. So the way we model our responses Y is that, so the thing I brought here is that we basically say that the PDF of the responses Y given some parameter theta has this kind of form. So all I'm saying here is really just the conditional distribution of my responses, conditional on some kind of parameter theta, is from the exponential family of distributions. Now, for these types of problems, often, so this is kind of really a regression problem, and obviously in regression problems, it's simply going to have some covariates, which I call X here. So actually the central focus or the central quantity of interest in this work is really actually the slopes of these, the associated slopes of these covariates. As for Y, I will talk about that soon as well. So basically we have these covariates, and then we're going to link these covariates with the conditional mean of Y, which we denote as mu, through some link function G. So finally, this H of rho here is going to be just some unknown spatial field that captures the residual spatial correlation in the responses. So this kind of model is commonly used for spatially indexed data. And I have some references there if you want to have a look. So this is kind of the spatial, for the spatial part, this is the model we'll be focusing on. Now, so this is just the spatial part. This is the first part of part one of the problem that we consider. So now moving on to the second part of our problem that we consider, which is the measurement error part. We also have this model of interest that we investigate. So we kind of assume that this model is correct. So for observation I from 1 up to n and covariate J from 1 up to capital J, we basically, we're going to assume that instead of observing our true covariates X, J, Si, we actually observe some error contaminated version of the covariates, which we call WJ, Si. So why is that a problem? Well, this measurement error problem is a problem because it's actually pretty well known that if you naively use W instead of X, that actually causes attenuation or a bias towards 0 of your estimators. So what I mean by that, so basically, if I go back to the slide here, you see that I have the covariates, the true covariates X here, right? But since we actually observe, what we actually observe is the error contaminated version W, then if we just replace this X with W, and then try to fit this spatial GLMM just naively using W, then typically our estimator for beta hat, say, that's going to have a bias or an attenuation towards 0. So it's going to be shrunk towards 0. And so that's kind of the problem. This attenuation towards 0 in this spatial context, that's the problem that we address in this work. So let me talk a bit about the literature that has been considered for this kind of problem. So in the literature, there has been several ways introduced to model the spatial correlation that's kind of governed by H of rho. And separately, there's also been many methods introduced for trying to deal with the measurement error in the covariates for non-spatial data. And for work that kind of deals simultaneously with the spatial aspect of the data as well as measurement error, there's kind of there's fewer literature that deals with that, but there is still some. So really the crux or the key idea of our work is that is to do with this last point here. So the thing with the classical or more traditional approaches to dealing with measurement error that has been introduced so far is that they typically need you to actually know the measurement error sigma j squared, or at least be able to estimate it from some validation or replication data. And but for literature for methods where you don't actually need to know sigma j squared or need validation data to estimate it, there has been this work by Hugh et al. In 2016, and they introduced a method for that. And for our work, basically we extend. So this Hugh et al. 2016 paper considers the situation where you have more or less Gaussian distributed responses. So they consider linear mixed models. And in this work, we extend their approach to a generalized linear mixed model framework so that the range of responses that you can kind of apply it to is a fair bit larger. So it isn't actually trivial to extend their approach from a LMM to a GLMM framework because, so for example, for linear mixed models, it's possible to actually get away with kind of just ignoring the spatial autocorrelation H of rho if all you're interested in is just point estimation. But for GLMMs, once you get into the GLMMs, it's not really feasible to ignore that. You have to take it into account somehow. So that's it for the literature. So now let me introduce the approach that we actually use to deal with this problem. So we call it double FRK. FRK stands for fixed rank Kriging, which was introduced by Chrissy and Johannesson in 2008. So the key idea of our work is basically we assume that the true covariates, the true underlying covariates xj are realizations from some kind of underlying smooth spatial field Gj. And so how's that related to fixed rank Kriging? Well, so fixed rank Kriging basically is a way to model smooth spatial fields, and they basically propose that you can model any kind of smooth spatial field with a linear combination of basis functions. So this Bj transpose Si is just some basis functions. So because if we assume that, or if we allow the assumption that the true covariates are smooth functions of the spatial field or smooth functions of space, if you like, then we can use fixed rank Kriging to model the true covariates X. And that's what we do. And so the reason why we call it double FRK is because, so we use an FRK for the covariates X, and we also use another FRK to model the spatial autocorrelation H of rho, or H rho. So we kind of model H rho also as a linear combination of basis functions B rho transpose. So that's kind of the main idea. And to summarize how our method kind of works, it can really just be summarized in 2 steps in the slide. So our method can be summarized as follows. So it's consists of 2 steps. In the first step, for each covariate xj si, we fit a basis function model. So you can think of that as just well, if you want, you can think of it as a generalized additive model, or you can think of it as a linear mixed model to the area contaminated covariates wj. So in other words, in the first step, we're going to fit this model. We're going to fit this model here. And so once you fit this model, we can actually, you can see that you can pretty intuitively get predictions for the true underlying covariate xj. And we call those predictions xj hat. And all you really need to do is just replace theta j here with the estimated or the predicted theta j that you get from fitting this GAM or this LMM here. So you can see that because we model the x as because we model this x as the smooth thing, we can model it with basis functions, and then that basically allows us, because you do you basically do a dimension reduction, and that allows you to kind of get past needing validation data to estimate the covariate measurement error sigma j squared. So that's the first step. So in the first step, we fit this LMM, we can get predictions. And then in the second step, basically you just plug in those predictions x hat. So instead of using W, we use x hat. And that's going to be better than W because we've predicted it. So the predictions are predictions for the true underlying covariate, as opposed to just some error contaminated version of the true underlying covariates. So in the second step, we just fit the spatial GLM as usual, using something like Laplace approximation. And yeah, you just basically plug in x hat instead of W, and then you just do that. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly talk about our simulations, or it's going to be just a brief snippet of my simulations. So basically, we simulated from a spatial GLM, as well as the covariate measurement error model, and we compared some slope estimates produced by different methods. So the different methods that we considered were, basically we considered our proposed method, as well as what happens if you don't take into account the measurement error, as well as what happens if you don't take into account the residual spatial autocorrelation, as well as what happens if you don't take into account neither of those things. So I just have one quick graph here. And the key takeaway from this is that our proposed method, which is this blue one, is the only one that kind of gets closer and closer to the true covariate or the true slope value as you increase the sample size. So and one thing that's not shown in this graph is that actually the three methods where you ignore either the covariate measurement error or the residual spatial autocorrelation, they actually end up with standard error estimates that are vastly underestimate the true standard deviations of those estimators, whereas our proposed method doesn't suffer from that. So to conclude here, we extend the work of Hugh et al. To a generalized linear mix model framework. And the key contribution of this is that we don't need any sort of validation replication data to estimate sigma j squared. And instead, we kind of exploit the inherent spatial autocorrelation of the covariates to get around that. And a key assumption here is that our covariates need to be some realizations of some underlying smooth spatial field. If it's not smooth, then this method won't work. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Zhu. I think we're running a bit over time, so I'll just ask for the questions just to be posted on the Slack chat for everyone, and we can just answer them from there. So we'll just introduce our third and final speaker for this session today, and we just got Michael, who's going to be talking to us about optimal staffing of classrooms with demand forecasting.
Yep. Easy. How do you use this thing? All good. Hi, I'm Michael, and the problem I tried to solve was optimal staffing, and in particular in a classroom setting. So in a classroom, what happens is students raise their hands to ask questions, and you have a variety of tutors walking around and answering those questions. And those students don't like waiting a long time to get their questions answered. But you can't just throw 1,000 tutors into a classroom and be done, because that costs a lot of money. And we know universities don't like spending lots of money. So this data here is showing what I collected. And these yellow lines show the size of the student queue in a classroom over time. So each square corresponds to a 2-hour class. And you can see the size of the queue increases and decreases as students ask questions and they get answered. What you notice is something interesting about week A. What's going on in that top right-hand corner? Well, I can tell you that is when an assignment is due. And yeah, so this is actually a big problem. Okay, so this is actually a big problem because what's happening is in these downtimes, we're spending so much money on tutors who basically do nothing for this time. But then on days when the assignments are due, we're way underspending. We don't have enough people in the classroom, and so students are waiting like potentially up to like an hour to get their questions answered. Okay, so the way I actually modeled all of this stuff was using what's known as an MMC queue. I'm not going to really go into the details to save time, but basically you have students and they join the queue at some rate parameter that you can estimate, and then you have a bunch of servers, which are tutors, and they help the students in the queue. Okay. The actual issue here is that we have a multi-objective problem. So we want to do two things. The first thing is we want to minimize the student wait time, but we also want to minimize the dollars spent. And these two things conflict. So what we actually do see is in this top bottom right, you get like a curve of possibilities. We select a number of tutors and you get an outcome, which is a total student wait time. But where do we pick on this curve? That's the question. So the approach I went with was to use an optimization-based approach, where we associate a cost with student wait time. So we'll say, we're willing to spend $2 for every minute a student waits. And if you include this, and then consider that paying tutors costs money, you get a curve like this, which shows the total cost for each amount of different tutors, and you want to find the minimum. So in this case, that's 3 for this class. Cool. Okay, so that's one problem, which is the optimization. The second one is demand forecasting, which is trying to predict how many students are going to be in the class. And as I just said before, probably the main predictor, and it is true, the main predictor of student demand is weeks when there's an assignment due. That's no surprise. But the second one, which is a little bit more subtle, is you have like this autocorrelation or temporal correlation of demand. So last week, we'll predict this week's demand level. And I make a very simplifying assumption with number 2, and that is you have two like underlying go to the next slide. You have two underlying like levels of intensity of student join rate. So you have like a low base level, which will happen some weeks, and it's likely that you'll go from low level to low level each week. But occasionally you'll have some weeks which are just generally just like higher levels. That could be like harder content, you're getting to a harder part of the course, and a harder level, a higher level is likely to follow a higher level week. Okay, and then each of these can have assignments or not have assignments. Okay, the actual way we do the forecasting is using a Markov chain based approach. So some really old-fashioned like statistical methods for weather forecasting use something similar. And basically what we want to do, we're currently in week 1, which is right at the very top there, and that fire symbol is saying that we're in a high intensity week. And what we want to know is what is the probability that in week 3, that's when we need to roster our staff, what's the probability that that's going to be high intensity? And you can work out if you apply some like transition probabilities from like high intensity week to high intensity week. I've said 75% chance, and then low intensity to low intensity. I've said that one's also 75% chance. You have some cross probability. Anyway, you can figure out or forecast what the probability is that in week 3, you'll have a high intensity week. Okay. And so if you apply this to some real data, what you notice is that if you optimally allocate staff, you get a massive reduction in queue time. So we save about like 30 hours of student life which is good. And it's a bit obscured by the thing there, but we also save about $2,000 in the operation of the actual unit itself. And that's just by like better allocating your staff members. Okay. So in summary, we have 4 steps. Build an MMCQ. We estimate the parameters from some real data, which I didn't really show here. 3, we forecast the intensity using some method, and I'm sure there's many other suggestions. And finally, we select the number of tutors, which minimizes some total cost over these forecasted days. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very great talk, and very new as well. So that ends our session today. We have a 5. How are we running a bit over time?